Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Vineet Chander, and I have the honor and pleasure and privilege of directing Princeton University's Hindu Life program, and I serve as one of the deans in the Office of Religious Life here at Princeton. This evening, we're so delighted to have two very special guest speakers with us who will be helping us to explore a spiritual classic, Autobiography of a Yogi, a text that is celebrating this year and this month its 75th anniversary. So a very significant and timely opportunity to reflect on a book that in so many ways, as we'll discuss this evening, has been transformative, not just informative, but transformative, that has helped to shape modern religious history, that has been a beacon of light and inspiration to spiritual seekers and practitioners from a variety of traditions, and that in some ways really embodies a very interesting and significant historical trajectory of spiritual wisdom coming from the East and having a more global impact, including here in the West. Let me take just a few moments to introduce our two esteemed guest speakers, and then I will be very happy to get our conversation started with some questions and prompts. So we'll do this a little bit like an interview, but also hopefully like a free-flowing conversation. And we want to hold some space and some time, particularly towards the end of our time together, for you all who are in attendance to have an opportunity to ask your questions and share your reflections as well. So I want to invite you to do that into the chat box. You can chat me directly in the chat box, and I will pass your questions along. Or if we do have time and our guest speakers are willing, as I said, we can have a little bit of a Q&A session afterwards. First, let me take this opportunity to introduce our two panelists or guest speakers. We're so happy to have with us Philip Goldberg. Phil is the author or co-author of numerous books. He is a public speaker and workshop leader, a spiritual counselor, a meditation teacher, and an ordained interfaith minister. His books include American Veda, From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, and the more recently published Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, Powerful Tools to Cultivate Clarity, Calm, and Courage. A Los Angeles resident, he co-hosts the Spirit Matters podcast, leads American Veda tours, and conducts online courses and workshops, along with blogging and writing regularly for such platforms as Elephant Journal and Spirituality and Health. Apropos of this evening's topic, Phil is the author of The Life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru, which is a comprehensive biography of the author of the autobiography that we're going to be exploring this evening. In January, Phil will also be teaching a course offering an immersive exploration of Autobiography of a Yogi for the Hindu University of America. And we'll put a link to that course in the chat box in just a little bit, as well as to Phil's official website, philipgoldberg.com. Phil is joined in conversation by Swami Kamalananda, or Brother Kamalananda, as he is known in his order. Brother Kamalananda has been a monk for more than 18 years in the Self-Realization Fellowship, or SRF, which is the spiritual organization that was first founded by Paramahansa Yogananda ji in 1920. Born in India, Kamalananda now resides and serves at the SRF International Headquarters in Los Angeles. A prolific speaker and beloved teacher, he has traveled throughout the US and India to give presentations on meditation, spirituality, and the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda ji. In his pre-ashram life, Brother Kamalananda studied computer science. After receiving his computer engineering degree in India, he came to the US to attend graduate school and received his MS in computer science. He worked as a software design lead at Microsoft in Seattle for 5 years before entering the ashram as a full-time monk. Again, we're so blessed and honored and grateful to have with us Phil and Brother Kamalananda in conversation this evening. So to get us started, I wanted to ask, this is a question actually for both of you, so whoever wants to answer first, you're welcome to duke it out. But I would love for us to start at the beginning. Many of us are at least tangentially familiar with the book that we're discussing this evening, but far fewer know much about its author, Paramahansa Yogananda. Philip, you've done substantial research on Yogananda, and you recently, as we mentioned, wrote that biography of him. Brother Kamalananda, you spent decades fully dedicated to Yoganandaji's lineage as a sannyasi in the order that he founded. I know it's a bit of a tall order, but could each of you give us, from your perspective, just a brief background of Yogananda himself, the guru, the man, the author, the person behind the book?
Swamiji, you first.
Oh, thank you, Phil. Very kind of you. Well, first of all, Vinitji, thank you so much for having me. And it's a really joy and privilege to share this platform with both you and Phil, who I have known for some years now, in his work for the film Awake, The Life of Yogananda, a documentary that came out a few years ago. In that connection, I did meet with Phil a few times. So this is like you said, Vinit, a very profound question. And it's almost like asking, can you just summarize the life of Krishna or Christ in a few minutes? It's almost like that, but I'll try my best. And of course, Phil, please jump in and fill in any holes and things that I may leave out. So let me, maybe the best way I can do this is to give a very quick biographical overview of his life, of Yoganandaji's life. And especially for those who may not know too much about him, Yoganandaji was born on the 5th of January, 1893 in Gorakhpur in North India at the foothill of the Himalayas. And he was raised in a Bengali family. And right from childhood, he was very deeply interested in spiritual matters. And he was always in search of his spiritual master. From a very young age, he met many great saints and sages in India as part of his spiritual quest. And eventually in 1910, he met his destined spiritual guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar. And the better part of the next 10 years of his life were spent in strict but loving discipline in his guru's hermitage in Srirampur, which is near Calcutta, and also some time in Puri in the east of India. Along with the training that he received in his guru's ashram, he got his degree in the University of Calcutta in 1915. And the same year, he was also ordained as a monk in the ancient Swami order by his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar. And he took the name Swami Yogananda at that time, which denotes bliss through the practice of yoga, union with God. And then soon afterwards, in 1917, Yoganandaji began his mission, so to speak, by beginning a how to live school in Ranchi in 1917-1918 timeframe. The Maharaja of Kasim Bazar gave his property to him to start this how to live school, in which basic education was combined with principles of meditation, right behavior, and so forth. It was a residential school for boys. And then in 1920, as he was getting the school strongly established on a firm foundation, he had a vision where he saw himself in America and hundreds, thousands of people listening to him speak there. And he immediately knew intuitively that this was God's message to him, that he needs to travel to America. Because on the very first day that he met his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, his guru had told him that one day you will be the one to carry India's message of yoga, specifically the science of Kriya Yoga that he taught, to the West. So in 1920, when he had that vision, he immediately embarked for Kolkata to meet his guru and to get confirmation from him if this was the time, and his guru confirmed, it is now or never, all doors are open. And he, soon after that confirmation, he got an invitation to speak at the International Congress of Religious Leaders in Boston. And in September of 1920, he arrived by ship. And he gave his first maiden speech in Boston, which was titled The Science of Religion. And right from the get-go, his message of India's ancient spirituality was received with open arms in the West to a large degree because of Yoganandaji's very scientific approach to religion. He called his first talk The Science of Religion. And he made the teachings of ancient India, the science of yoga, very accessible to all mindsets, whether they had a devotional mindset or an intellectual mindset and so forth. And soon after he gave his maiden speech, he was invited to speak all over America, in the East Coast specifically. Until 1924, he gave many lectures at many universities, including Harvard University and other churches and clubs. And in 1924, he embarked on a transcontinental tour across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast. And towards the end of 1924, he arrived in Los Angeles. And in 1925, he established his international headquarters in Los Angeles, which is the building that you see behind me in this virtual image. That building, the white building behind me, the rooms on the top right, where my thumb is pointing, were his rooms. And in 1925, he purchased this property and he established the international headquarters, and his work continues to this day from this center. Between 1925 and 1935, he traveled extensively all over America and gave talks on the science of yoga and to hundreds of thousands of people. And like I mentioned earlier, his message was very warmly embraced all over. He spoke to capacity audiences in New York City, Los Angeles, all the major cities all over America. In 1935, he made a trip back home to India and to meet his guru for one last time. His guru sent him a telepathic message that he was about to leave his body, and Yoganandaji made arrangements to go and meet him. And in his course of the visit in India, he met several prominent people like Mahatma Gandhi and C.V. Raman, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and many other prominent people. And his message again in India was received with open arms. He came back, and when he came back to America, he focused, he cut back his travels. And in the meantime, one of his senior disciples had gifted him a very beautiful seaside hermitage in Encinitas in Southern California, where he really started working in earnest on his book, The Autobiography for Yogi, which is the subject of our conversation today. And he also started focusing more on training very serious disciples who wanted to dedicate their life completely 100% in seeking the spiritual realization and the message, the teaching that he brought. So the latter part of his life, he focused on his writings. He compiled the series of home study lessons, which we continue to distribute from the international headquarters here in Los Angeles, and also from Ranchi in India. He also worked on his interpretation of the scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, which is now called God Talks with Arjuna, and his interpretation of Jesus's life and teachings, the second coming of Christ. And he worked on several other books as well. And then in 1952 is when he took his, what we call the Mahasamadhi, conscious exit from his body. He had been invited by the ambassador of India, who was visiting LA at that time, Binay Ranjan Sen, at a banquet in Los Angeles, in downtown Los Angeles, the Biltmore Hotel, which still stands today. And very prophetically, as Yoganandaji himself had predicted much earlier, that he would leave his body with his boots on and speaking of India. And he recited the last few phrases of his poem, My India, and his last words were, where Ganges, woods, Himalayan caves, and men dream God. I am hallowed, my body touched that sod. And as he said that, he lifted his eyes to the spiritual eye, and he then gradually collapsed to the floor, consciously leaving his body. So that, in a a nutshell is, his life. And I will turn it over to Phil now to fill in all the gaps and other things that I may have missed out.
Well, thank you, Swami. That was an excellent summary of what I spent over 300 pages writing. And I just want to add for the listeners that the details in that synopsis are of a unique life and an important life and a really interesting human tale, because what he did to accomplish what he did, the obstacles that came before him and how he overcame them, what it was like to be a representative of an ancient tradition from the East with dark skin and long hair and orange clothing in the 1920s and 30s, and what it was like to run a spiritual organization, a nonprofit organization, as a monk who was not a citizen through the Great Depression and World War II, and with the opposition that was often strong. All that makes for a wonderful tale, and makes Yogananda and all that he accomplished, in my eyes, that much more admirable and that much more of somebody we can all try to emulate. I'll just add that the result of his spending the better part of the last 32 years of his life in the West, from age 27 to his passing at 59, made him, if not the most influential, certainly one of the 2 or 3 most influential of all the representatives of the tradition we think of as Hinduism in America. And his impact cannot be underestimated, largely because of Autobiography of a Yogi, but not exclusively. Also because of all of his other work, the organization and the stability of that organization through time, his other written work, and everything he accomplished in those decades he was here. His influence was immense, especially in my generation of sort of baby boomer spiritual seekers in the 60s and 70s, and to this day. So I just want to add those elements.
Thank you so much, Phil. While we have you here, I'd love for you to just expand on this a little bit. Where in this wonderful synopsis of Yoganandaji's life, where does the decision to write the autobiography come in? And to that end, help us to understand in its own time, what kind of decision would this have been? Would this have been seen as something quite radical, even controversial, for a spiritual master, a monastic, to pen, not just something personal, but to actually pen an autobiography and title it as such?
That's a more complicated question than it may seem on the surface. Brother Kamalananda can verify this or not, but it's pretty rare for a monk to write about his or her early life. We don't find that very often. I've researched the lives of all the teachers who came here from India, especially, and they'll mention parts of their early life, especially if they're asked about it. But it's very rare for somebody to go into any great detail about their upbringing, their family, their early experiences, the details of their lives with their during their schooling, their initiation into the monastic life, their gurus. It's not very common. And I'm sure there are always traditionalists who would object to such things. But that's what happens to innovators. And Yogananda was both a traditionalist and an innovator. And I find that combination of qualities has made certain teachers who came here representing foreign traditions more effective than others if they can uphold with integrity the tradition at the same time adapt to a new culture and a new era of history and so forth. That combination is essential, and Yogananda was a master at it. With respect to the decision to write the book, that one I found very interesting in researching it. As Brother Kamalananda said, the last period of his life, he was stationary more or less in Southern California, and he knew that his priority should be securing his legacy for after his passing. He somehow always knew he would not have a long life, and 59 was not a long life. And so he focused on training people to carry on after him and securing the stability of the organization, and primarily the written word. And there was a great outpouring of, hundreds of thousands of words that ended up in books. And the autobiography of a yogi was high priority. But as anybody who reads it can see, it's a kind of strange hybrid. It's not just a life story. And I know you want to speak about that. So he had a few books in mind, and in a strange way, Autobiography of a Yogi was kind of a combination of two of them, a personal memoir and stories of great saints and yogis kind of combined. But he knew that this book in particular would help secure his legacy for the future after he was gone. I can't remember the exact quotes, but he said it very explicitly. This was important. And so he worked maybe too hard, with people who did editing and transcribing and so forth for quite some time. And finally, it was published at this time of year in 1946. Did I get that right, brother?
I think you're perfect, Phil. And I think I agree with everything you said. I think it's very accurate. Maybe I can just add a little texture to a couple of points that you've made, specifically about when it was decided that he would write the book. I think it was decided even before he came to America. His guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, told him during, when he was undergoing training in his hermitage. Swami Sri Yukteswar's guru was the great householder, spiritual master of Varanasi, Lahiri Mahasaya, for those of you if you read the book. And Lahiri Mahasaya himself had predicted, Lahiri Mahasaya was also the guru of Yoganandaji's parents. So there was a connection there. And Lahiri Mahasaya himself had predicted that about 50 years after his passing, that there would be a great surge of interest in the West, in India's science of yoga, and that an account of his own life would be written around that time. And so Sri Yukteswarji had conveyed that message to Yoganandaji, and he said, Mukunda, I know Yoganandaji's name was Mukunda at that time, said, Mukunda, you have to do your part in writing about that sacred life of Lahiri Mahasaya. And Lahiri Mahasaya passed in 1895. And in 1945, exactly 50 years after Lahiri Mahasaya's passing, is when Yoganandaji completed the book. He wrote the last words of his final chapter, and it took some months after that for the book to actually get published. So it was quite prophetic. And he actually started working on the book even before he left for India, because one of his great direct disciples, who eventually became the president of SRF YSS, Sri Dayamata, who entered the Hermitage in 1931, She said that in one of the early days when she had just entered the ashram, Yogananji called her to his study and he gave her a few pages and he said, these words will go into a book that will come out later on. And so please keep them safely and file them away. And when she took them away, she said he had just written the chapter, The Tiger Swami. And so little by little, he was working on the book as and when, his very demanding schedule allowed him to. But then, as Phil and we have been talking about earlier, it was only after 1936 when he came back from India was he able. Actually, it was more 1937, 38 onwards. He was able to dedicate really quality time in writing the book. And just to also add to what Phil said about the rarity of a spiritual master writing an autobiography, it is absolutely true. In my own little experience as well, especially in among the contemporaries of Paramahansa Yogananda, I do not know of anyone who has actually written a book, an autobiography. And in fact, as a young seeker on the path, when I first came across the book, even the title was a little odd to me at that time in my own limited understanding, because it's an autobiography of a yogi. And growing up in India, at least many years ago, my understanding of the word yogi was someone who was, he was, very a rarity, someone who lives in the jungle or in a cave, and they practice very, very seriously, and they dedicated their whole life. But then, as I read the book and understood more, I recognized what Yogananji was saying is a yogi is anyone who practices yoga. It's you don't have to be a renunciant, you don't have to be following a certain lifestyle. Anyone, even a businessman, a scientist, a professor, an artist can be a yogi, because yoga, and by yogi he meant not just those who practice asanas, hatha yoga, but those who actually practice, in addition, perhaps the inner science of meditation, of God realization, and that is a yogi. So, and what makes it even more of a rarity, in my opinion, is that here was a book written by someone who had never spoken or given a talk in English until he had left India. The first speech he had given in English was on the ship coming to America. He had never given a talk in English. And he, as you know, if you read the autobiography, there is a very fascinating story of how that unfolded, the miracles, so to speak, that happened for him to be even able to give that first speech. And from someone with that background to write so eloquently, to the degree that now this book is used in universities, in some universities and courses, in English literature, to teach people, English literature and comparative religions and philosophy and psychology and so forth. So it is quite, he was a trailblazer and really ahead of his time in many ways.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that we're approaching this book from all these different angles, and I love the kind of balance between what Philip is suggesting in terms of the kind of the practicalities of Yoganandaji's writing the autobiography, in one sense later in life as a kind of an intentional act of legacy, but also hearing the kind of almost mystical seeds that are planted earlier. So I love the balance that we're striking here. Brother Kamalananda, I'd love to ask you along those lines to help us kind of unpack the autobiography a little bit. And I know I've heard this from others as well. For the first time reader, it can be quite surprising that a book that has autobiography in the title is in many ways, not that it's, of course it is about Yoganandaji, but it's at least as much, if not more so, about these amazing personalities that he encounters, that he meets, that he has these mystical, and I think you use the word miracle, so these almost miraculous encounters with. Is that by design? How can we understand and appreciate what's going on with the autobiography in terms of its description of all these other personalities?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vineet. And you're absolutely right. The autobiography is as much about Yoganandaji as about some of the other great saints and scientists and great other, even social leaders like Mahatma Gandhi that he writes about in the book. And I think one of the reasons why the autobiography is so popular and endearing to hundreds of thousands, millions of people perhaps, is that it is actually in some ways a scripture. At least that's how I see it. It's not just a story of one person's life, but weaved into those very fascinating stories and mystical experiences that he has and that he sees other great saints and sages have that he met. I think Yoganandaji is actually, in a very subtle and sometimes a very overt way, conveying deep messages, deep teachings, spiritual teachings. And that's why, like Phil was saying earlier, he predicted that this book will change the lives of millions and it'll become my messenger after I have left. He actually said those words. So it has been my experience that if I read and assimilate and introspect, the book is actually a scripture. From each story, from each experience that he describes, I can learn something of how to apply that teaching in my own life. For example, the years in my master's hermitage is one of my favorite chapters, where Yoganandaji goes into great detail about the training that he received in his guru's ashram, from his guru, sometimes very strict, but very loving discipline and training. And some of those, each paragraph, each page in that chapter, I can spend days reflecting on those words and trying to make them my own and apply them in my own life. Some of the quotes that just come into my head right now, when Sri Yukteswarji is training his disciples and the other disciples in the hermitage, he says, finding God will be the funeral of all your sorrows. It's so beautiful. We are all trying to get over the sufferings and sorrows of life, and here he's saying finding God will be the funeral of all sorrows. And then he says things like, look fear in the face and it'll cease to trouble you, or forget the past. Often people, I think it's a very compassionate message as well, and because people generally tend to beat themselves up when they make mistakes in their lives and they feel like, I'm no good, I can't be really a spiritual seeker. And his guru conveys to him, he says, forget the past. The vanished lives of all men are dark with many shames. Everything in future will improve if you make a spiritual effort now. So each of these quotations, has such relevance and universality and timelessness that no matter what one's background and upbringing and religion, vocation, nationality, it's so universal. I think that's one of the reasons why the book has been so endearingly accepted by people in all nations, in all backgrounds. Phil, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I think that's a perfect note. Brother Kamalananda Swamiji, you're speaking of the book sort of going beyond national boundaries and touching hearts and touching lives the world over. Phil, I know this has been a project of yours, dare I say, a lifelong project, or at least a many years, maybe even many decades long project of yours to really deeply understand and help to articulate the coming of this Eastern wisdom to the West. And it makes perfect sense that you should also look at Yoganandaji and look at the autobiography in that light, because in some ways it really seems like the autobiography kind of kicks off a very special era of Hindu or dharmic wisdom crossing over to the Western world. And in some ways, at the risk of perhaps, invoking a cliche, the book itself seems to embody this kind of East meets West dynamic. Could you share a little bit more about this and the significance of the book in that regard?
Well, there were, of course, antecedents to Yogananda's coming here and the work he did and the autobiography. His illustrious predecessor, Swami Vivekananda, came to the West, to America, the year Yogananda was born. So there's a generational factor. And Vivekananda's influence on Yogananda himself was profound. And so there were people primed for Yogananda when he came. But, 1920, was not the accessibility to these teachings and to transportation and communications technology was not the same as it would be in the post-war years, and especially after the 1960s. When the sort of watershed of East meets West was that period between the mid-60s and mid-70s, when a number of prominent gurus came here and established a foothold, and the counterculture of the baby boomer generation embraced these teachings in a huge way. And there were, celebrity factors, mass media factors. And in that context, when I was researching American Veda and I asked people how they first discovered the teachings of India and embraced them and brought them into their lives, if they mentioned a book, it was far and away more likely they would mention Autobiography of a Yogi than any other book. And it made the rounds. I will show you the copy I read in 1970 when it was being, books like this book and my copy of it were being passed around from person to person. Oh, you have to read this. You have to read this. And maybe we read Alan Watts, and maybe we read Aldous Huxley, and maybe we read a Bhagavad Gita. But then there was this. And oh no. Do you hear me? Yes, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
The book I borrowed and never returned is still with me all these years later. And now I'm rereading it for, I don't know how many times I've read it in the past, but I'm teaching this course you mentioned starting in January. So I'm rereading it and I'm discovering new things. And I'd already read it a few times, and I'd already written a biography of Yogananda. So it's one of those books people return to, and the impact has been tremendously profound. And one of the truly interesting things about that, yes, a lot of people read the Autobiography of a Yogi because it's given to them as a gift, or they stumble on it somehow, or they're looking for books like this. And then they become students of Yogananda's work and maybe disciples and initiates in that tradition. But a far greater number of people read the book and find their way to what, some other lineage or some other teachers, or, and I'm one of them. I had already embarked on my past. I already had a sadhana. And then I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and it just strengthened everything and opened new doors and new perspectives. But I never became a direct disciple. But he's I always say he's my premier upaguru. I've learned more from him than anybody but the teachers I studied directly with. And it's that kind of influence. And many people have found their way to, Buddhist teachers because they read Autobiography of a Yogi, started exploring more widely, because it's a door opener to many, many people, and a confirmation that if they're already on a path, they're on the right path. And here's a role model. Here's somebody who lived it. Here's a real human being who achieved these states of consciousness I'm aspiring to. It also opened up for many people a desire to go to India, because there's, you get glimpses of Indian culture, especially in the, early days of the 20th century. And you say, oh, I want to go there. It has an effect on people in many ways. And it's one of the extraordinary things about it.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I'm pardon the interruption, but I think this is a great place to maybe dig in a little bit, and I would love to hear brothers' thoughts on this as well. I'm so glad, Philip, that you brought up this point of something that I find very striking about the autobiography as well, which is its ability to rise above a kind of sectarian conception. And there's something really interesting here. And so I especially want to direct this to Brother Kamalananda. The autobiography is understandably, of course, very beloved to followers of Yogananda, and I imagine has won over many a reader to become active as devotees of Yogananda, as members of Self-Realization Fellowship, or some of the other organizations that are also dedicated to his teachings. But to this point that Philip is making, it also seems to have really transcended the particulars of the Kriya Yoga tradition itself, and has been embraced by spiritual practitioners, readers of many traditions, or even those who don't identify with a particular tradition. As a devotee in the lineage, brother, would you please share with us your thoughts and feelings about this kind of unique feature of the book, to be able to straddle the line between the general, the particular, the universal, and the sectarian?
That's a great question. And I loved what you said, Phil, earlier, sort of touching on some of these points that Vineet is raising now. And, the way I think about it is that Yoganandaji had two main roles. One is the Sadguru, and the other is the Jagat Guru, something like what Phil was referring to him as the Upaguru. So the Sadguru is when someone embraces Yoganandaji as their spiritual master, as their spiritual teacher, who is going to guide them step by step on their spiritual journey to their home back in unity with the divine, the goal of self-realization. So there are thousands of people who have, like myself, not just the monastics, but even hundreds, thousands of lay disciples all over the world who have accepted Paramahansa Yogananda as their Sadguru. Those are the followers of his teachings and who have made a commitment and so forth. That's one role. The second role is that, he's a Jagat Guru. A Jagat Guru is one who someone can be inspired by just one nugget of truth that Yoganandaji may have said or written somewhere, or maybe a few nuggets of truth, but they never feel the need to embrace him as their spiritual teacher, because they maybe already have a spiritual teaching and teacher like Phil, or many other people who may be in a state of in their spiritual journey where they don't yet feel the need to actually in a very conscious way practice a specific teacher or teaching. And he could even inspire people in whatever sphere of work that they're doing. For example, a business person or a scientist may read something in the autobiography or in one of his other books and just listen to one little nugget and say, okay, that's what I need for my next step in my evolution, in my business or in my artwork or science work or whatever I'm doing. And that's why it is, I think, so universally appealing to people, from all walks of life, because the way Yoganandaji conveys his message in the autobiography is very, very non-threatening. People can be following their own religion or spiritual journey or no, spiritual path as such, and yet find something that enhances their life or helps them deepen their own spiritual life to some degree. So does that answer your question somewhat? I'm not remembering the second part of your question, if there was a second part.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it does. I mean, what I hear you speaking to is really this, I think, a kind of a very deep-seated maturity, spiritual maturity, and security to be able to not feel threatened, as you said, by others' paths, and also a kind of I read it as also a kind of a genuine well-wishing, like we talk about loving kindness or being a well-wisher of all, and it's practically impossible to encounter Autobiography of a Yogi and not feel that energy of genuine well-wishing. And as Phil said, whatever path one ends up on, there's a sense in which the book is encouraging us along on whatever our paths may be. And so I think it's just such a beautiful feature of the book. I want to bring Phil back into our conversation to talk a little bit about, and we've kind of been speaking around it already, but how this book really ends up, even to the present day, becoming a kind of a must read for spiritual seekers and practitioners. We can say, of course, and we've discussed already, in many ways, it makes perfect sense given the wonderful qualities of the book. But we can also kind of look at it in the sense of how things become sort of trends. And I'm wondering if either of you or both of you could speak to this sort of what ends up being the tipping point that helps to make Autobiography of a Yogi now a kind of, as I said, a kind of a must read, or I mean, I don't want to sound too cynical about it, but it's almost like there's a certain cachet to having it on your bookshelf if you are a spiritual person. And I'm wondering if you could address that.
Whether you read it or not. No, it does. I think most people who have it cherish it. People have, in my experience, they're either wildly enthusiastic about it. It has biblical kind of properties to people who are devotees and for whom it's the most important book and the most influential book. And there's other people for whom it's just was a really interesting read, that is something they learned from, and they have other books and other teachers and everything as well. And that, I think, would have been perfectly fine with Yogananda. His whole teaching mission was, here are these teachings, and he understood some people will become ardent devotees and disciples of his, and other people will learn something and go about their business. And that was how he approached his teaching. It's also how I'm sure he'd be very happy with people absorbing what is in Autobiography of a Yogi. It's, you could say, required reading. It's essential in the libraries of yogis and seekers in particular. But I would say any spiritual person of any spiritual tradition. And part of that is its uniqueness. There have been many spiritual memoirs, especially in the last 40 or 50 years, written by like American yogis and Americans who go on journeys to India, and Americans who become Buddhist monks or whatever it is. Americans who become swamis in one lineage or another. But it is rare, and it was rare, even more rare, for a renunciate from India, who lived the life of a traditional yogi and a traditional guru-disciple relationship, in a traditional ceremony of becoming a swami, all those things in the first half of the 20th century. To have a memoir from somebody like that is unique. And therefore, there's a great deal to be learned in these pages. And the portraits, as we've mentioned, it's not just his life story. One of the reasons I wrote the biography I did was because less than 10% of the Autobiography of a Yogi is about his life after he came to America. And I was determined to, fill in those gaps. But the portraits of people like Ramana Maharshi and Anandamoy Ma and all the other lesser known saints and yogis and great historical figures like Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi and certain scientists, Eastern and Western, those are important features of history, and there are spiritual lessons in there. And I would hope some PhD student takes the Autobiography of a Yogi and eliminates everything else and just reproduces everything in there about Hindu philosophy and yoga practices, because it's kind of a primer. If you just look at that information, what he would have called the science of religion and the science of Kriya Yoga and the law of miracles and all these treatises in the book about the nature of consciousness and the nature of spiritual path from that yogic perspective. In the midst of everything else, you get these lessons. Do you agree, brother?
Perfect. Yeah, I do agree. Like I said earlier on, it is like a scripture, right? There are so many lessons that are hidden in those stories, and one needs to read them and repeatedly, like you are doing, Phil, now. And each time you read, you get a new thing. That's same experience I have, and so do other readers. And since you showed your copy, your beautiful edition from the 1970s, I want to show the 75th edition, which we just came out with. This is a beautiful special collector's edition that Self-Realization Fellowship just brought out. It's a nice slipcase edition, and it's available on Amazon and on the SRF website. So for Autobiography for Yogi lovers, this is a little bit of a I wanted to put this in so that if you are interested in getting your own copy, you're welcome to order it. And just to build on what Phil was saying, I think one of the reasons why the Autobiography is on so many people's bookshelves, whether they're spiritual seekers or not, is one, its timeless message; two, its universality, because what Yoganandaji shows in the Autobiography is the essential unity of all religions, that they're all saying the same thing but in different words, because the prophets of those religions came in different places and at different times, and so they use a language that was appropriate and the vocabulary that was available to them at that time, but the essential unity is the same across all. They're all the same. That's a message, or key messages of the Autobiography of a Yogi. And there's this sense of balance in the book and in general in Yoganandaji's teachings between East and West, between science and religion, between the inner and the outer, between activity and silence, right? So he comes across as being a very balanced individual. He's not asking people to change their entire lifestyle to be able to follow the yogic path. You don't have to renounce your work, and you don't have to go into a jungle. You don't have to go into a hermitage. You don't have to become a monk or nun. You can be who you are in your world and lead a very spiritually fulfilling life by just making certain adjustments in one's lifestyle, right? So, and following a very disciplined spiritual path. So I think that is what people find appealing. And I think one of the roles that the Autobiography has played is that it's such an excellent ambassador of India's science of yoga and culture and philosophy to the West, right? I mean, as an Indian, I can say that the Autobiography in many ways has made Indians and India proud of the heritage that India, the spiritual heritage that India has offered to the world. Just like, science is, a certain country can make a discovery, but if it is a scientific discovery, it's available to all nations, right? Like, the vaccines or whatever. Similarly, the science of yoga that India has dedicated its greatest masters for the many, many centuries, that science of yoga is universally available now to the whole world through treatises like the Autobiography. And right in the first sentence of the book, Yoganandaji clarifies what is the essence of Indian culture, right? And he says, let me see if I can read it right from the book here. He says the characteristic features of Indian culture have long been the search for eternal verities and the concomitant disciple-guru relationship. Right there, I mean, he says what Indian culture is, true Indian culture is all about is a search for eternal truths. And the search for eternal truths cannot happen without the disciple-guru relationship. They go hand in hand. So just in those couple of sentences, or in one sentence, I should say 2 lines, he clarifies the ultimate purpose of life, and also what Indian culture and philosophy and spiritual teachings have offered to the world at large.
Thank you. Thank you. So powerful. We are arriving towards the end of our time. We had sort of budgeted to go till about 8:15. For those who can stay, we understand if folks do need to leave, since we are at the hour mark now. I have just a couple of more questions, but I also want to give an opportunity to field some of the questions that are coming in from the chat box. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat box, but before we do that, I can't resist. I would be remiss if I didn't ask this, and it may be on some of our minds. There is the celebrity issue, and for those of us who are, especially, and I consider myself one of these, Beatles fans, the Beatles connection. In fact, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, that iconic photo on the cover of that album, right? That iconic image has, if I'm not mistaken, and we have 2 experts here, so they can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe not only Yoganandaji, but his 3 predecessor gurus are also present in that gathering of folks, in that kind of photo collage on the cover. What to speak of course, George Harrison of the Beatles, very directly stating that Autobiography of a Yogi was the kind of seminal transformational book for him. Elvis Presley was a reader of the book. Hollywood, actors and actresses, and maybe more closer to some of our hearts, maybe if you're an Apple user, Steve Jobs apparently was his favorite book. Can you speak a little bit to the particular connection and appeal to, for lack of a better term, the rich and famous, the celebrities, the VIPs, and why it continues to resonate so much in these kind of celebrity circles?
I can talk for a long time, especially about the Beatles connection. When I opened American Veda, the first sentence says, when the Beatles went to India in 1968, it was the most important spiritual retreat since Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. It was a watershed moment in bringing East and West together. The antecedent to that was George discovering the sitar in the mid-60s, taking Ravi Shankar, the great maestro, as his music teacher, going to India with Ravi Shankar, and being given 2 books, especially one by Swami Vivekananda and Autobiography of a Yogi. That transformed George in a spiritual way. He became this great seeker that he would later be. And he led his mates in the Beatles to transcendental meditation and then to Rishikesh. And George, for the rest of his life, would give out copies of the Autobiography of a Yogi to people he felt were in the need of it. And he was an all-purpose seeker. He was a Bhakta who was very much involved with the Hare Krishna people. He was very much involved with the Transcendental Meditation people and with Yogananda and the Autobiography and the Self-Realization Fellowship. That the celebrity factor was always important in getting these messages out because they got attention, and the Beatles are the quintessential example of that. But even in Yogananda's early life, there were disciples like famous orchestra conductors and opera singers. And in the lives of later gurus, they were rock stars, or there were people like,
I'm almost done, honey.
prominent business people like Steve Jobs, who decreed that the Autobiography of a Yogi should be given out to everyone at his memorial service. So, yep, that was a big one.
Do you want me to speak to that, Vineet?
Difficulties? Oh,
If you'd like to add something to that, or we can go on to the next question as well, whatever you'd like.
Yeah, no, I think I can just I think Phil has covered it very beautifully. I can just say that, like I mentioned earlier, the book is universally appealing to people from all stratas of society, from the celebrities to the quote unquote, the lowliest, people who have humble professions of whatever. And I think one of the reasons it has struck a chord with some of these celebrities is some of them reach the pinnacle of their careers and they reach the ultimate success from the worldly standpoint of whatever it is, music, science, business. And then perhaps they come to the realization that something is still missing in their life. They've reached what they felt was their ultimate goal, and fame and wealth and possessions or whatever. And then they feel like, oh, I didn't get what I thought I would get by achieving these things. And so they start seeking. And to a large degree, the Autobiography of a Yogi helps them answer some of these questions that they may have, like, what is the purpose? How do I really achieve happiness and contentment and fulfillment and so forth? That's it, Vineet. Thank you.
Thank you. My final question, before we move into questions from some of our attendees, and actually this overlaps with one of the questions from the attendees as well. There is, I think, at least in the West, a certain assumption or presumption that when we speak about autobiographies, we better make sure that it's the truth. And there's sometimes tensions around, and we've seen this perhaps in recent years and in recent decades with, some investigative report or something coming out and debunking someone's memoirs or someone's autobiography, and it ends up being quite a scandal sometimes, or quite problematic, right? So there seems to be this starting point, this baseline assumption that what we're talking about is literal truth on every page, and if somehow it can be shown that something is not sort of true in that literal sense, we've got a problem. How do we sort of throw this into the mix and navigate a text like Autobiography of a Yogi, which to a certain read seems so fantastical and really challenges our notions of, from at least a Western academic or perhaps scientific frame of reference, what is sort of demonstrably or objectively true. A kind of a related question, I know that's a lot, but a kind of a related question is, does the reader have to sort of believe in the literal sense everything they're reading in Autobiography of a Yogi for it to be a meaningful experience, in your opinions?
no. The short answer is no. Just as if you went to hear Yogananda or any of the other famous emissaries from India give a talk in public, you didn't have to believe anything they said. You just have to be interested enough to try it out yourself. And that's one of the reasons these teachings gained a foothold in America. No, they never asked anybody to convert or to believe anything they said. They just said, here's what we have to offer you. Try it out yourself, in a true scientific sense of, here's a hypothesis, do your own experiment. And so you don't have to believe it. And what Vineet is referring to primarily there are not the details of Yogananda's personal life, which, some of which can be verified, and most of which, as in anybody's personal life, there's no way of verifying it. But the descriptions of what we might call miracles and wonders and great yogic feats of consciousness that he describes, I've met two kinds of people who believe every word of it, and for whom that is the most important and interesting and enchanting aspect of Autobiography of a Yogi. And then there are people who don't believe any of it, who are highly skeptical and think he's either making it up or he's been deluded, but they love the book and get something out of it anyway for other reasons. So, these are, to me, when I speak to people about it, I say, don't, if you have difficulty believing these stories, it doesn't matter. Treat them as good stories. Let it be food for thought. Contemplate it. See if in Yogananda's explanations of these things, he doesn't teach you something about the nature of consciousness or what is possible to be human. And maybe you can't conceive of these kind of miraculous things that yogis are purported to do. But if you do these yogic methods, if you begin to meditate in the way, the yogis describe, you'll find yourself with better intuition. And that'll be a little hint that maybe there's even more possible. But you don't have to believe any of it to get something out of the book. Do you agree, brother?
Yes, Phil, that's very well said. And actually, I can talk from my own experience. When I first read the autobiography, I couldn't grapple with many of the stories myself. But I intuitively knew that just, the way the book is written, and it just touched my heart as it does, millions of other people, that there is an intuitive understanding or recognition that everything he's saying is true. But my limited understanding at that moment in time wasn't big enough to understand everything he's trying to convey. And there are things in the book which happened, which later in the course of history have been proven to be true. For example, he talked, there's a beautiful chapter called the cauliflower robbery, right? Where this Yogananji has these beautiful cauliflowers in his bedroom, in his hermitage, in his guru's ashram, and he's stored them under the bed secretly. But this fellow comes, he's hankering for a cauliflower, this thief basically, and he goes into his room and picks up the cauliflower, and how Sri Yukteswarji is sort of remotely guiding this person to go to the right room, pick up the cauliflower and leave without touching anything else. And it's a very fascinating story. And this happened in the 1910s, before radio came on the stage, right? And then Yogananji describes, he said in the beginning, it was very hard for him to understand how Sri Yukteswarji was using telepathy to control someone else's mind. But then he says, when radio came on the stage, it just clicked. And, things that, the way I try to reconcile or try to help other people reconcile with some of the fantastical stories is, look, things that are happening today. I mean, the very fact that we, 70 of us are sitting on this Zoom call and seeing each other, being in different parts of the world, instantly we are seeing each other and hearing each other. 200 years ago, if you told somebody that this was possible, they would think you are nuts, right? I mean, it'd be a miracle. What we are seeing right now, it would be a miracle 200 years ago. And, not what to say about 1,000, 2,000 years ago. And so what may seem miraculous right now to us may not be in a few hundred years from now. Will just be common, things in life. It's just that as science hasn't evolved enough, that we can explain many of the so-called miraculous stories. But there's a whole chapter in the book called The Law of Miracles, where he does explain how these phenomena work. So It's a very good question. Thank you.
So a follow-up question related to that came in through the chat from one of our attendees. They're asking about an epilogue that was in earlier editions of the book, in which there was a kind of a narrative involving some scientific testing of Yoganandaji's physical body after his passing. Perhaps readers of the book or those a little bit more familiar, with the background will recognize this. But according to our attendee, in presently printed volumes, this epilogue has not been included, and they're wondering if there's a specific reason why the epilogue has been removed. So I want to put that question out there, and I want to broaden out that question a little bit. And I realize we're just about at the end of time, so maybe this can be our last question. But also just thinking about sort of towards the future, how decisions are made in terms of kind of both preserving the book for what it is historically and spiritually, but also making sure that it is accessible to future generations of readers, and how that sort of process of kind of editorial curation happens.
Brother should address that.
Okay. I think by the epilogue, the person probably means there's a little section at the end of the book called Paramahansa Yogananda, Yogi in Life and Death, and just a one-page thing. And it is there in this special edition. And it talks about the incorruptibility of his body, when they were the Forest Lawn Memorial where his body is kept, the curator there sent a letter to Self-Realization Fellowship that in his experience of decades, he had never seen a state of incorruptibility in someone's dead body like that. So I'm not sure which edition the person who asked the question has, because as far as I know, every edition that is published by Self-Realization Fellowship has this epilogue at the end of the book. But there are many other editions as well that are available on the internet. So maybe some of them don't have, but every edition of SRF will have that. And the second part of your question, Vineet, is in terms of the accessibility and the continuing future publication of this book. Of course, Yoganandaji's words are sacrosanct. We are not going to touch his language, his words in any way. But as time goes on, there may be some additional information about maybe the state of Self-Realization Fellowship, or pictures of the ashrams and so forth, like up-to-date pictures, like this special edition of the 75th anniversary, 75th special collector's edition has some new pictures of the legacy ashrams that he established in color, in full color, that were perhaps not there in the earlier editions. So things like that, and maybe some footnotes to corroborate some things that he may have said, but in terms of the actual text of the words that he used, there will of course not be any changes to that in the editions that SRF publishes.
Thank you for that clarification. A really important subject, and one I wish we had more time to get into, because it is really quite fascinating how a book takes on a life of its own, and how language evolves, language changes, our sort of understanding of language and idiomatic expressions change, and it's such a fine balancing act. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness in that answer. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but it's a much bigger subject. We have reached the end of our time. I did say that would be my final question, but I'm actually going to take that back, and I can't resist. I'm going to ask one more question, just because I think it's so pertinent, and it's something that was also shared by one of the attendees, and that is this unique moment in history that we find ourselves in. Perhaps every generation feels that their moment in history is the unique one, and that's true. But we can truly say we're living through unprecedented times in so many ways. We are in the midst of this global pandemic. We are connected in ways unimaginable, as brother, as you pointed out, but we're also really feeling in some ways very disconnected. There are ideological divides, there's political divides, there's racial strife. there's so much that we're contending with. Some people speak about mental and emotional health crises. In this moment, in this precious, fragile moment, what do each of you think the autobiography of a yogi is trying to tell us? Just very briefly, maybe in a sentence or two, what is the message of Autobiography of a Yogi for us today in America in 2021?
You know, when I first stepped on my spiritual path and discovered the teachings of the East, including the autobiography, it was also unprecedented times. It was the late 60s and the Vietnam War was going. There were assassinations and cities were burning. You know, civil rights movement was on. It was a time of great tension and turmoil. I felt at the time that these universal teachings of what is possible for human beings and what we truly are beneath all the relative differences and points of argument and superficial identities, what we truly are, what we're truly capable of, was an important antidote. And it was that to me and my friends, and we felt to the larger society. And here it is 50 some odd years later, and I still feel the same way. These teachings bring us to higher states of being, to the identity of love and compassion and bliss within us, and therefore it's truly important to bring them out now as an antidote to the madness out there.
Yeah, well said, Phil. And I think just to, I just support that. And I think the clear message in the autobiography and also in Yogananda's teachings is to summarize in one sentence, because, you know, the world will always go through its cycles of ups and downs, right? There's, like you said, Vineet, every generation feels like this is the moment in history that, you know, there's a crisis happening. And the key message is, I think, in my opinion, reform yourself and you will reform thousands. In other words, if we want to see world peace, if we want to see a utopia in the world, it has to begin in each individual heart, right? We cannot achieve world peace and harmony by having peace conferences and the political and social leaders coming together and discussing how to make that happen. It'll never come about. You know, that's just the reality of it. The only way peace can come on this earth is if each individual becomes peaceful and then reflects and manifests that peace in their life, and then consequently impacts those, you know, they work with and live with and so forth. And I'll just read this two sentences from the autobiography, which sort of captures, you know, what we've been talking about. So Yogananda says, utopia must spring in the private bosom before it can flower in civic virtue. Inner reforms leading naturally to outer ones. A man who has reformed himself will reform thousands.
Amazing. Amazing. What a moving and powerful statement to close on and a reflection to leave us all with. On behalf of Princeton University, on behalf of our Office of Religious Life and our Hindu Life program, we're so grateful to Brother Kamalananda ji, to Philip Goldberg, and to all of you for sharing of your time and presence, and for spending this time to reflect on this precious gift, this treasure of spiritual wisdom that we have now been graced with for 75 years, and God willing, for many, many decades and centuries to come. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening and be well. Namaste.
Thank you, Vineet. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Vineet.